we bring you the fifth of this season's book and author luncheons, transcribed earlier this afternoon at the Grand Ballroom of the Hotel Astor, Times Square, New York City. These affairs, a mainstay of the city's cultural life, are co-sponsored on a non-profit basis by the New York Herald Tribune and the American Booksellers Association. Among our distinguished speakers today are Elmer Davis, Gilbert Highet, and Arthur C. Clarke. Here now is Rita Van Doren, editor of the New York Herald Tribune and mistress of ceremonies of these book and author luncheons. Miss Van Doren.
First guest today, our first speaker, is Gilbert Highet. Some of you may have been here 4 years ago, I think it was 4 years ago, when Gilbert Highet positively electrified this audience by his talk on the classical tradition as it is preserved in the world around us, in our arts, our politics, our thought. For it is his special gift to be able to make knowledge exciting and relevant to our lives. This gift is better known to you today, probably, than it was then. For since that time, he has become the chief book critic for Harper's Magazine, and for 2 years has been heard once a week in a series of radio talks on literature. These talks, sponsored by Oxford University Press and begun on a small New York station, have attracted a wider and wider audience, so that now they go out over WQXR network in New York and New England, and are heard through the CBC in Canada and through local stations in Chicago, Washington, Los Angeles, Seattle, Louisville, and other cities. Born in Scotland and educated at Glasgow and Oxford universities, Mr. Highet came to New York when he was only 31 for a one-year visit to Columbia University. At the end of that year, Columbia apparently liked Mr. Highet, and Mr. Highet liked Columbia, with the result that he accepted the university's invitation to become professor of Greek and Latin, and with the exception of the years spent in war work of various sorts, he has been at Columbia ever since. In addition to his book on the classical tradition, he has written a trenchant, lively discussion of the art of teaching, and has collected some of his radio talks into a little book called People, Places, and Books. Man's Unconquerable Mind, the present book, is Mr. Highet's contribution to the celebration of Columbia's 200th anniversary. In it, he asks and suggests answers to such questions as what limitations are there to the development of the human mind? Is any censorship justifiable? What does education mean? He points out that it is the thinking mind that carries man both to evil and to good, that all history is the process of learning, that knowledge is power, and power entails responsibility. And he brilliantly describes the faith of a Western university. In this short discourse, with its wit, its eloquence, its deep sincerity, there is a constant awareness of the urgent march of the mind throughout the ages. I'm happy to introduce to you its author, himself a stimulating example of the unconquerable mind, Gilbert Highet.
Mrs. Van Doren, ladies and gentlemen, it's always an honor to be your guest, and after such a kind welcome, it's also a pleasure. I've been thinking for a long time now about history. What is it? There are lots of definitions, many epigrams, many broad attempts to delimit it. It's awfully hard to define, though. In a sense, history is all we experience and think. The Herald Tribune, whose guests we are, is, in fact, engaged in writing history every day. It attempts to select the important events which will prove to have been important in 20 years, 100 years, or 200. Yet, it's terribly hard to tell what are the important events. That is, what is it that actually makes history? What is worth putting down? Sometimes I see my colleagues who are in the field wandering a little forlornly through the library stacks, looking at the mountains of facts which are accumulating. in the moment or two since I rose here. Another 1,000,000 facts have occurred, and some of them have to be chosen for record. And in the moment since I started that sentence, another 1,000,000 and another 1,000,000. Which are the facts which matter? Which are the facts that make history? Well, it's awfully hard to say, but to begin with, history appears to be about the relations between groups of people. Individuals come into it only insofar as they affect the relations between groups. Suppose you were writing a history of the United States, for instance. You would begin by the great event with which the group who were to call themselves Americans broke loose from the other group which represented the British Empire. Then, I suppose you would describe that particular group, calling themselves Americans, as they spread over the continent and came into contact with other groups, contacts of different kinds. Their contact with the Red Indians, their contact with the African Negroes, and then the irruption and appearance of other groups still, the immigrants from Europe and some from the Far East. Observe, if you were writing such a history, you wouldn't treat them merely as events affecting individuals. You wouldn't describe the Sandbergs coming over as a family. You would describe Lutheran Swedes, Irish Catholics, Polish Jews, Southern Italians, Protestant Scots, and so forth. It would be a story, would it not, of the interaction of groups of people. Then, if you continued this history, you would sketch the developing relations of the group called Americans with other groups in this continent. The Canadians, the Mexicans, the Central Americans, and the South Americans. And now, the most recent phase of our history is the American group's involvement with others all over the world, with whom, to begin with, it had no contact whatever, with South Africans, with Indians in India, with Pakistanis, and so forth. Suppose you agree so far, then, ladies and gentlemen, suppose history is a story of the relations between groups. Now, what kind of relations? The usual answer when I was taught history was always relations involving power. That is, the history one read of medieval Europe was always about the battles between various nations, the battles between dynasties to gain power, the struggle between the Pope and the Holy Roman Emperor, and so forth. These were power relationships. Well, suppose we attempt to define history only as power relationships between groups. Does that cover it all? You know it doesn't, ladies and gentlemen, it doesn't at all. For instance, the events of our lifetime have been marked off for us very clearly by two enormous power struggles over and a third still continuing. Within the lifetime of most of us, we have seen two enormous wars, both of them called world wars, both of them essentially power struggles. These have changed history. They've changed all our lives and the lives of all the inhabitants of the planet. But other changes have ensued, other changes, transformations have happened, which have apparently nothing to do with the power struggle at all. For instance, within the last 40 years, the literacy rate has gone up all over the world. The infant mortality rate is going down. New transport routes have been opened up all over the world. The world's output of mechanical energy is increasing enormously, and in fact, civilization is altering in a positive direction, not to be understood simply through the struggle for power between groups. There must be some other kind of history as well. Historians say, yes, there is another kind. This is a kind of relationship between groups which is definable in terms of wealth. What matters, they say, is how one group extracts wealth from another, how it exploits, how one class exploits another class, how two groups exchange goods and services, and so forth. True, that's the work of the economic historians, and you will agree it's absolutely vital also. And yet, is that enough? We know, as soon as we ask the question, that that also is not. It's only an idiot, such as a Marxist, who would think that the whole explanation of history was economic. Many of the greatest events in our own history and in human affairs cannot be explained without the gravest distortion by economic terms alone. The Crusades, for example, the career of Napoleon, the career of Mr. Lincoln, the career of Mr. Jefferson. All these things cannot be explained, even largely, in economic terms. There must be some other kind of history still again, some other sort of relationship between groups. Well, I suggest, ladies and gentlemen, that there is a third, and that it is educational. I suggest that we might understand a great deal of history by looking at groups of people as learners and teachers. I believe that much of the most drastic and important change in our own public lives and in the history of the last 2,000 or 3,000 years has been an educational and intellectual change, not a power change and not a wealth change, except indirectly. Let's take some examples. The most drastic example I can think of at present is one where a nation of 30 million people deliberately put itself to school and by doing so changed its own history and the history of the world. That was Japan. In 1868, or say in the 1860s, Japan had been sealed off from the rest of the world almost completely for many generations. That is, it had refused to learn anything from the rest of the world or to teach anything to the rest of the world. There had been no communication. Now, you and I all know the tremendous effects of what is called the opening up of Japan. But what was that opening up? Did we impose power on them? Not that chiefly, nor did they on us at that time. Did we begin to extract wealth from them or to exchange goods and services with them? Yes, but that wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing was that they suddenly decided to learn from all the rest of the world by a conscious policy. In 1868, the emperor took an oath, which was the beginning of modern Japan. It was called the Charter Oath. It ended with this extraordinary phrase. Imagine this as part of the constitution of a country. This is the last phrase, quote, "Knowledge shall be sought for throughout the world." And that was the real meaning of Japan's opening up. From then on, they had no constitution, they had no army, they had no navy, they had no money, they had no calendar, they had no sciences, except the most primitive kind. And between 1868 and roughly 1890, they sent out dozens of missions to learn from the rest of the world and imported no less than 5,000 teachers into Japan to teach them all these things. They had no constitution. They sent out a commission which toured America and Europe and came back with a constitution learned from the Kingdom of Bavaria. They had no bank and no money system. They quite soon found the disadvantages of that when the Westerners got in. So they sent out another commission which came back with a model for the Bank of Japan. From the Bank of Belgium, they learnt how to have a bank and a finance system. They had no army. They had a collection of clans. They sent over, as you would expect, to Germany and brought back a German military mission which created within a matter of 10 years an army powerful enough to win a dangerous civil war. They had no navy. They sent a mission over to Britain, which at that time was the leading naval power, and you know the subsequent effects of the Japanese Navy. They had no proper calendar. They had only the Chinese calendar. They learnt that also from Western nations, and so forth. That was, you see, ladies and gentlemen, not really a political move, nor an economic move. It was an intellectual move, and that changed history. If you wish to think how much it changed history, ask yourself what would happen if other nations of the same approximate size and strategic position, say Burma or Java or Egypt, had determined as strongly to learn from Western nations. There are other examples of this. The example which touches me most, of course, is Rome. The Romans found themselves almost by accident in the possession of enormous material power and wealth in the 2nd century BC. Enormous. Most empires would have stopped there and just continued to consume the wealth and enjoy the power which they had accumulated. The Romans, for some reason, did not. They went to the Greeks nearby and said, "We are stupid. Teach us. We have no literature. Show us how to write books. We have no arts. Help us to make arts. We know little about science. Tell us about that." The Greeks, always willing, of course, always ready to hear or to tell some new thing, charged in and said, "Yes, allow us." And from then on, a new kind of civilization was created, the sort of civilization on which you and I partly depend, because it was through the Romans that you and I got the marvelous and essential intellectual discoveries of the Greeks. Japan, Rome, and ourselves. That is our real relationship as a group to the Greeks and Romans, ladies and gentlemen. We are, in fact, their pupils. Our real relationship to them is, and should be consciously, an intellectual relationship of teacher and pupil. Some examples. Who is the greatest living English poet? It's Eliot. And Eliot, in his most notable poem, pictured himself, and said so loudly, pictured himself as the Greek seer Tiresias. What is the most famous of all recent novels? James Joyce's Ulysses, modelled on Homer, in which Joyce pictures himself as the son of Ulysses himself. Who is the greatest English playwright? Shakespeare. And Shakespeare made his career on imitating and ultimately surpassing the tragedies of the Roman writer Seneca and on drawing material from Plutarch's Lives of the Greeks and Romans. You may think that's only literature. Well, remember when you visit Washington next that the center of the United States government is held in a Greco-Roman building named after the governmental center of Rome. It's called the Capitol, and the senior body is called the Senate. Remember also that democracy did not exist for many centuries in Europe, nor here, until you might remember also that the peculiar problem of our own democracy, which worked most powerfully on the Founding Fathers, was how to keep it stable and level. And they took as their model the ideal of checks and balances, the balance of powers. They didn't invent that. That was passed to the Founding Fathers by the French philosopher Montesquieu. And Montesquieu got it from the Greek philosopher Polybius, who got it from inspection and admiration of the Roman republican system. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, a nation cannot grow without roots deep in the past. These are only a few examples of this strange phenomenon, the movement of ideas through space and through time. It's an odd phenomenon. It haunts me. One of the oddest things about it is that you can never be sure the ideas, the movement of ideas will be specially good. It may be dangerous. Take one of the simplest of all, the radio. The radio sounds like an awfully good idea because it helps communication. And so it may be among us who are literate. But imagine yourself attempting to govern a large population which was illiterate. Imagine yourself determined to exercise power over that population. It strikes me that one of the best ways you might do it would be to put a radio, a little cheap radio, in every village or in every house, and then to supply it freely with propaganda interspersed with folklore, songs, sports results, and so forth, until in 3 generations you would have conditioned such a population to do exactly what they were told. Such a small invention, an idea which you and I think of as important but not vital, as the radio, might, in another civilization, mean the difference between life and death, freedom and slavery. It's a fabulous subject, the movement of ideas, ladies and gentlemen, and all I've hoped to do with it is to suggest some of its powers to you. But if it is true that civilization is partly or largely based on the movement of ideas, then you see the difference between backward nations and progressive nations. You see the difference between a free country and a slave country. The backward nation is a nation which will learn nothing from others and is unable to teach others anything. A progressive nation is one which constantly learns from others and which allows ideas to circulate freely within itself and sends them from itself around the world. The Iron Curtain is, in fact, an intellectual slavery, and our own free exchange of ideas is the best of all possible hopes, not only for our own future, but for the future of mankind.
You see what I meant when I say he has a genius for making history come alive.